Through the 1980s, the big mainstream Hollywood horror franchises like Elm Street and Friday the 13th felt like they were aimed at teen audiences, popcorn movies for a Friday night. But other, lesser-known, low-budget indie horror films were taking the genre to new extremes.
Did you really kill your mama?
I guess I did.
In 1986, director John McNaughton made a low-budget horror film loosely based on real-life serial killer Henry Lee Lucas. The marketing for Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, linked the film to popular horror franchises at the time. The film even included a tagline that said, "He's not Freddy, he's not Jason, he's Henry." But this was nothing like a Freddy or Jason film. The nasty, unflinching filmmaking made it a deeply disturbing and uncomfortable watch. And it wasn't the first home invasion horror film of the 80s to achieve this. Many speculate whether Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer was in fact influenced by a lesser-known Austrian horror movie from 1983 called Angst.
Yeah?
Angst was also loosely based on a real-life mass murderer, and the film, directed by Gerald Cargill, was a brutal and nightmarish home invasion movie, which, like Henry, aligned us squarely with the psychotic serial killer as our main character. Although it wasn't widely seen at the time, it's hard to ignore Angst's influence on movies that would come later. Not just Henry, but the films of Gaspar Noé, Michael Haneke, Lars von Trier, and many of the films we now come to think of as quintessential home invasion movies. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Gerald Cargill's Angst and John McNaughton's Henry. We're back. Welcome to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season exploring the home invasion subgenre, and this is part 14. In this episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be discussing two deeply disturbing serial killer movies from the 1980s, Angst from 1983 and Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer from 1986. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. I know, sadly, if you're in the UK, it is a little bit difficult to track down Angst. I had to order a US import Blu-ray in order to see it, but I would urge people, if you can check it out, please do try and give it a watch before you listen to our discussion. So joining me to discuss these two nasty movies, I've got the king of nasty practical effects with me, the man that invented so many of the grisly and nightmarish body horror that we were to witness in films like The Human Centipede 2, Possessor and Infinity Pool. It's the one and only Dan Martin. Hello, Dan.
Hello. Thanks for having me back. It's nice to see you again.
Lovely to see you again. Thank you so much for being back. Dan, what have you been up to? You're always working on such exciting projects. Anything you can tell us about right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of TV stuff at the moment this year so far. We've got a TV thing with Ben Wheatley coming up this year, which is really exciting. Some films in the pipeline that I obviously can't talk about. I was out in Belfast doing some stuff for the second series of Wreck, the BBC show, which is really fun. Yeah, sorry, I can't
awesome.
Spill more. No. We've had some fun prosthetics on a new picture recently, which I definitely can't discuss. But it's one that is being filmed under a fake name, so that fans of one of the cast don't turn up and cause problems.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be here. So we've got some nice, lovely messed up films to talk about together, which is always exciting. Let me start off by asking you, Dan, about this kind of area that we're discussing this series, this subgenre of home invasion. Again, it's kind of been really interesting to hear people's reactions to home invasion and what they think about it. But what are your thoughts generally? Do you find yourself kind of gravitating towards home invasion movies as a rule?
It's one of those ones. I mean, I think this can kind of be said of every subgenre that one enjoys, which is that as soon as it starts to see a bit of success, it becomes kind of a wash with stuff stuff that's not as great.
Yes.
But like almost every other subgenre, there are gems within it that are so good. And often they have something that sets them aside from the very sort of cookie cutter mass output.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get early films that kind of set that shape for the cookie cutter that did something really interesting, and the things that followed maybe didn't do it quite as well. But I think today we're going to be discussing two that have been so influential, and I think one influenced the other as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But they're really it can get under your skin, I think, in a way that other subgenres maybe would struggle with. It's like a shortcut because it's an invasion of the personal space. I think either with you or definitely on the Arrow podcast, I've talked quite a bit about this idea that Western and particularly colonialist countries tend to have the majority of their horror set in another place. And it's often about going somewhere and being unwelcome or finding a dangerous thing. And it's sort of predicated on this colonialist idea of the vengeful savage. Whereas Eastern horror is often a lot more about the invasion of the personal space, ghosts and, creepy girls coming through your telly. But yeah, so American home invasion and Western home invasion films are sort of the antithesis of that foreign spaces because it's the refuge, it's where you're safe. And I think that one of the reasons it's so like upsetting and like triggering is that when you watch a movie in your house at the end of it, or if it's too much for you in the middle of it, you turn it off and suddenly you're no longer in a jungle or a space station or even a cabin in the woods. You're home where you're safe. But if you're watching a home invasion movie at the end, or if it's too much and you turn it off, you're still in the place where that horror was happening.
Yes.
And I think that's a really like, it takes away all of the comfort of the real world that you can fall back on when you're watching horror.
Totally. And there is something about it that feels like, oh shit, this could happen, right? As well, like this could actually happen to me. Have you, and a few people have spoken about kind of experiences they've had here and there. Have you ever experienced anything of that, especially living in London, Dan? Any kind of break-ins or anything like that?
No, I've been lucky. We've never had an actual break-in. Like, I've had stuff pinched every now and then, but that's normally through carelessness and opportunity. I've never had a full-scale like break-in to the house. I've got friends who've had stuff taken. It is really horrifying when your space is invaded like that because it's... because it takes away that sanctuary. It takes away the safety of privacy. And I think that the subgenre kind of grew in the West, grew out of that idea of the growing, or rather the eroding of the barrier between private and public space. And people feeling that the outside world was more chaotic and less controllable, and home invasion is a response to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to rewind back. We're going to the 80s to talk about these two films. I'm really excited about this. This first one, this was a first-time watch for me. Angst, we're going to kick things off with, from 1983.
So Angst is ostensibly based on a real crime that happened in Austria, and it was incredibly taboo of them to sort of approach this. Everyone was quite upset with them. But ostensibly it's about it's an adaptation of a true story about a young man who had been imprisoned for a violent attack, or a second violent attack. He'd done a short stint in prison for stabbing his mother non-fatally. And then he'd done 10 years for the killing of an elderly woman. But they had decided that he was probably safe now after 10 years and could be released. And on the first day post-release, he broke into a home of three, one person's home who had two family members visiting, and then proceeded to torture and murder them. And then on it goes. So it's really a sort of a recounting of that, but played through it is a sort of inner monologue of that character. So not fully uniquely, but quite rarely, it really carries us with the the villain, with the murderer.
Yes.
And is one of those, and I always like it when it's done well, one of these sort of studies of what's going on in the mind. And the voiceover is actually built out of things that was said during a psychological evaluation of Peter Curtin, who's a different, the vampire of Dusseldorf, who's a different serial killer from Nisek, the guy who came out of prison and immediately killed the family. So they've sort of, and I think there was a third serial killer who was sort of in the mix somehow as well. So he's a conglomeration of different real killers.
Indeed, which we'll get into. So tell me, first of all, Dan, what do you think of this film? What's your kind of history with it?
I was a relatively late comer to this one as well, actually. It's one of those ones where when I watched it, I was like, how were people not telling me I should watch this every day of my life until I watched it, because it's so much my bag. I was recommended it in 2019 while we were shooting Possessor. There's an amazing physical media shop in Toronto called Bay Street Video. And I was visiting there with Karim, the cinematographer of Possessor, and Rob Cottrell, the one of the producers and the line producer, and the first AD. And we were like picking through all the stuff. And I saw the American Blu-ray of Angst. And I thought, this looks interesting. And Karim saw it over my shoulder and he's like, have you not seen Angst? You have to see this. And I watched it. He was completely right. It's absolutely amazing. It's like finding the missing piece of a big jigsaw puzzle, Angst.
Right.
It sort of connects so many things I love. And it's I wouldn't say it's a fun watch, but it's a great watch. And I think it blends elements that don't necessarily feel like they would go together into something that really works for me. It's quite an experimental film.
Yeah, I loved it as well. This was a movie that I've seen it twice now, but only in preparation for this. So I came to it when sort of planning this home invasion series because I'd heard and I'd read about it, and so many people told me I had to include it. It's really good, isn't it? I mean, like you said, it's not necessarily the most fun thing to sit through, but I was stunned by like just the direction, the cinematography, which I'm sure we'll get to, just the way this movie looks and its kind of vibe is absolutely incredible. And like you said, you can really feel that kind of connective tissue. You can see how much this movie clearly influenced and particular filmmakers that this film clearly influenced, right, as well. It's kind of fascinating to see in that regard.
Yeah, it's one of those sort of hidden gems that you can just pick out directors from a lineup who've seen this movie because it's influenced them.
100%. Why haven't more people heard of this film or seen it? Why is it not more readily available in the UK? It's so frustrating.
It may be now that if someone tried to release it, it would get through, but for a long time it was just considered too much. Like it got refused releases fucking everywhere. It was socially and politically taboo in Austria. It was considered far too extreme at the time of it being made to get a UK release, or you know, in many European countries. And I think it's really only America's obsession with its, you know, freedom of speech and how that transfers over to physical media.
Yes,
that means that we see stuff like that because it's still an unrated release in the States. But yeah, it's amazing. But the thing is, you look at some of the things that it's inspired, that it's so clearly inspired, and a lot of them are more extreme. And actually, if you read the story about Nisek, like what actually went down on that day is way worse than what's depicted in the film. Like they were very restrained.
That's interesting. Yeah, you're right, actually, because it was, I mean, it's a nasty film, but it's not maybe as bad as what I had in my head when people kept telling me this film is really extreme and nasty. You know, like there's like you said, there's been a lot worse stuff out there that has come since that I'm sure was influenced partly by this movie as well.
Yeah,
but, how do you find it? You know, maybe let's start off with that idea of it being based on a true story, because obviously that's the case with both these films we're going to talk about today. It's always a tricky thing, right, to kind of exploit something like this that is real. But how do you find it, and how well do you think it's handled this in terms of, like, you know, recounting this true event and also putting us in the head, I suppose, of this serial killer?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting argument, and I think that there have definitely been some examples relatively recently where I very much objected to real stories being used, and it was just because of the particular type of exploitative that it felt. This doesn't feel cheap and leering. It feels like an artistic study. And I think that means it's allowed to. in the rules that I've made up in my head. Like, it's it's not doing it for cheap thrills. It's certainly not trying to titillate or make you, it's not like I think if you did, like, I don't know how the hell you do it, but if you did this as like an action film where you're rooting for this stuff, then obviously that's going to be problematic. The other thing is that I think because if they decided, we don't have insight to his thing because we don't have the interviews, to his internal monologue, so we're just going to make it up, that again might have been a step. That might have been a misstep, because then it's very easy to... And I didn't know until researching for this that about them using the Vampire of Dusseldorf's stuff for that, like things he had said and things from his psychological analysis.
Wow, I didn't know that either. So they were sort of direct quotes from somebody. Interesting.
Like paraphrasings, I think, but it's assembled out of things that were said by real serial killers discussing their crimes and what they had done. So I think it is... I do think there's something slightly more honourable in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And it doesn't feel, like you said, it doesn't feel titillating or exploitative. And I think, like you said earlier, like these movies that put us in the head of these people, when done well, they are really interesting. They're uncomfortable in an interesting way, right? I mean, even it's a little bit reminded me of... in a very different way tonally, but a couple of weeks ago, Jamie Graham and I talked about A Clockwork Orange in this season too, and that kind of, our narrator breaking into people's homes to kind of rape and murder them, right? There is something of that, very different tonally. That movie is almost, in some ways, more uncomfortable because it's so kind of sort of silly and fun and almost slapstick in places, whereas this film really isn't that as well, right? Like, it does feel like it takes what's happening seriously in this movie, Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, so the cinematographer Rybczynski, who we mentioned earlier, says he feels like they didn't go far enough, like that it should have been more confronting, it should have been more shocking, and that if you're dealing with this kind of thing, then you have and I'm paraphrasing heavily, that you have a sort of responsibility to confront the audience with that. And I agree. It's already quite hard to watch and already quite hard to find.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about other films that are possibly stronger, harder when we discuss other films in this subgenre.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's an interesting one because it is so confronting, and it doesn't try to be light entertainment.
Agreed. What do you think of the way this movie looks then? Like, you've talked about it already as this kind of artistic expression, I suppose, in some ways, of what's really happening here with this serial killer, but this direction by Cargill and that cinematography and editing as well, it's just got such a unique kind of look and vibe, hasn't it? That kind of gliding camera and that almost kind of God's eye view.
I love it so much. Basically, so Cargill was a film enthusiast, film journalist. He ran a magazine, but wasn't a filmmaker. And he met Rybczynski, who had started off as a cinematographer and become a director, a filmmaker, an animator, sort of an experimenter, an artist within film. And they'd gotten on, they'd become friends, and they'd talked about making a movie together. And this was the film they kind of decided on. And I think what Rybczynski wanted to get from it was artistic experimentation. He said in interviews that he only is really interested in doing cinematography jobs if he feels there's an artistic angle to it.
Sure.
But like on a technical level, for a film with no money that was basically being personally bankrolled by the director, they built some incredible camera kit. Like this, the kit they built from scratch for this movie puts your Evil Dead slidey cams to shame.
Yeah.
So I first knew it as referred to as a snorri cam, which is what they called it on Pi, when you strap a camera to someone and then they become static in the frame and it's always in front of someone or behind someone.
Yes.
This made many years before Pi invented one of those, but they had a sort of metal hula hoop worn by the actor where the camera was on an arm, counterbalanced by a light. And then the cinematographer is scuttling along behind the camera or under the camera so that he can spin it, so that you've got the snorri cam, but it can move through doors, it can rotate 360 around the actor, and it gives that amazing sort of manic claustrophobic close-up for that action when he's running around the house, when he's panicked, he can't get out, he's pushing people over. He's like, it's such a frantic, frenetic sequence. And it's such a beautiful piece of kit. It works so smoothly. On top of that, they were building wire cams where they would have like several tons of tension pressure of tension on steel rope, and then they'd have the camera suspended from metal pipes over that rope that they would then puppeteer with rods so they could turn it and tilt it while absolutely hell for leather running through the woods, and the camera would be sliding above head height, not hitting anything because the pathway was already established, and then it was just up to them to like sort of like roughly point it at the actor.
Oh my God.
The entire movie was shot without a viewfinder, so they could never see through the camera, so every single shot was a guess.
Oh my God.
They didn't have the money for multiple takes, and to make things harder, the entire film was shot in a mirror. They built a rig so the camera was facing down into a 45-degree angle mirror because that was the only way they could make some of the shots work.
Oh my God.
And because it was too expensive to flip those shots and incorporate them into normal footage, they decided, rightly or wrongly, I think they might have regret the rod for their own back that they built, that they should shoot the entire movie through mirrors so that they could just flip the entire final positive of the film.
Holy shit. I did not know that. That's insane.
So they shot the entire film in a mirror with no viewfinder.
Oh my God. It's unbelievable that it came out as well as it did, right? It is stunning.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful, and it looks effortless. It looks effortless and it's smooth. Every shot looks so perfect. And
well, it's because everything glides so much.
That's what it is. It's the gliding, isn't it? Because you're right. I mean, like, it remind Pi, Darren Aronofsky I felt like really kind of like popularized that style, didn't he? That kind of camera strap to the chest. Yeah. We used to call it kind of Aronofsky cam when we were young, when we used to talk about it. And
I'd do it in my short films. I made one out of wood.
Yeah, exactly. And they always looked a bit kind of, even when Aronofsky did it, and part of that was part of the effect, but it looked a bit kind of jarring and jangly, right? Whereas there's something about this, it's almost like the camera is kind of omnipotent, it's omnipresent, it's not, it's like when you watch a kind of virtual camera in like an early David Fincher film or a Pixar film, it's like the camera isn't really there because you're thinking, where is the camera physically here? How is it doing 360 turns around this actor? Yeah. It's amazing.
It makes the action much more experiential.
Yeah.
You're there with the very, very long shots means, you're not getting all these big edits. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not fast cut at all. The handheld stuff you do have, which is relatively sparse, feels very like run and gun news footagey, and that's interspersed with these amazing stuff done on. I think they paid the guy that changed the lights in their town and had a crane in beer to let them film from that crane. So all those massive, like, sort of Argento-esque, like, jib shots are just done on the piece of kit that was used to change the lights in the town.
Amazing.
Like, everything was borrowed.
Yeah.
Or belonged to a friend. And it just turned out so beautifulty. And all of those things, which feel, if handled by almost anyone else, they'd feel unmotivated, or they'd feel showboaty, or they'd just feel incongruous. But actually, they fit so well with the idea that this is because of the voiceover, because of the voiceover, both its presence, having a voiceover, and because of the dialogue the monologue that's actually being used, you get this real feeling of being inside the person without having to resort to POV, which it doesn't do.
Yeah, you're right. And it's so much that there's something about this whole world, this whole reality that feels kind of heightened, doesn't it, really? Like, I think, we'll talk about this with Henry, but it feels like with Henry, it's going much more for a real kind of gritty kitchen sink realism or something, right?
Yeah.
Whereas this movie,
absolutely.
There's something else, isn't there? The performance styles, the way people look down the camera lens, like, everything is sort of bigger and heightened in a really weird kind of interesting way, I think, in this. And again, I guess it's that almost subjective viewpoint or something that we're getting in this film,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like that, not to jump too hard into spoilers, but towards the end when he's being asked for paperwork by the police, and the voiceover is, because there's very little dialogue in the film, but his monologue is like, this is exciting. I'm really excited by this. And you do feel throughout the film that you're being, like, it's pulling back the curtain on his psychosis, I think, and this cinematography is such an intrinsic part of that.
Yeah, it is. It's really interesting. And what do we think of him then? He doesn't even have a character name, does he? I think he's just known as the psychopath.
I think he's just called K.
Yeah, and played by Erwin Leder. What do you think of this antagonist, this anti-hero at the center of this story, and the way that he's portrayed?
Yeah, I mean, he's really good. He feels like he's being steered.
Yeah.
Like he's being puppeted, which is interesting, and I think part of that again is the camera rigs, and part of it's his performance. He feels pretty unhinged, but he has the vibe of someone who is doing like an ungodly amount of preparation for a weird sex thing.
Yes,
like he's got that kind of like manic fervor.
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
It's interesting. He's sort of, I think he's alt handsome in a way. Yeah. As well, which makes him really interesting. He's got a bit of the Alfie Allen to him.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he? And he's a bit weedy and he's a bit pathetic as well, isn't he? You know, again, like when we talk about Henry, he's quite big and imposing, and there is something kind of there's I don't know, he's got such a kind of interesting, slightly sort of weedy, panicky way about him, this guy as well, right? Which in some ways makes him even more frightening and unhinged. I think that he feels a bit unpredictable as well, this guy, you know?
He's very skittish.
Yes, skittish is the word.
And he's very quick to sort of cut and run. There's the bit in the taxi at the beginning where he's thinking about throttling the female taxi driver, and he's fumbling around trying to get his shoelaces off, so he's got a garrote.
Yes.
And she's like, "What the fuck are you doing?" And he just panics and runs.
Yes,
runs out of her car.
It's so good. Like I have no idea. We only know about serial killers from films and true crime and this kind of thing, but I can almost believe this kind of thing happening. Like somebody kind of psyching themselves up to do something, and then they can't quite get the right opportunity. And there is something in that, in the kind of first act to this film, right before, even when the home invasion moment happens, and he's first spotted by a member of that household. Again, he kind of panics and runs around a little bit as well, and there is just this, like you said, this feeling of skittishness and kind of panic about him the whole way through.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like I said earlier, I think often the most interesting entries into any subgenre are the ones that don't abide completely by the rules. When he goes into the house, it's empty. Like, he is joined in the house, and I think again that works as a sort of an additional level of scary, because when you, like, it's not all like guys in balaclavas with crowbars prying open doors, or like, you know, you're not looking out into the garden and there's like three people with old masks and bags on their heads. They could be in your house right now and you wouldn't even know.
Yes.
And that's such a scary thing. It's why I was so taken with those stories about people finding it in Japan, finding out they had someone living in their crawl space. There was like a spate of those stories for a while. And I'm sure, I've not seen one, but I'm sure there've been movies made about them. Although actually, no, there was one. There was one with Pep Tozar in it, where he's living under that woman's bed. It was at Fright Fest like 5 or 6 years ago.
That? I remember that. It was great. And there were a few like, there's been a spate of like wall person movies, right? Like people living in walls.
There's so much shit going on in walls. Like movies that aren't about wall people end up in walls now. Like the walls is the gauntlet of modern horror.
Exactly that. But yeah, like there is this complicity, I suppose, to us watching him get into this house and prepare and wait, and there is that kind of interesting tension of, is he going to get discovered? What's going to happen here? How is this going to play out? Yeah.
Because unlike Henry, he doesn't have the physical strength to overpower people particularly easily. He is a more slight individual, and it's really only through opportunity that he can do these horrible things. Mm-hmm. I mean, it speaks to reason that his victims are a young woman, a guy in a wheelchair, and an elderly woman. Yeah, you know, like those are crimes of opportunity.
And to add to that kind of uncomfortable feeling of complicity, I think, as well as being kind of very much aligned with this serial killer, we also get his inner monologue, right, running throughout. The film is just filled with, there's not much dialogue in the actual film, right, but the film is filled with this narration, these kind of mad ramblings of this guy's inner monologue. What do you think of that? Is that there to kind of give us a bit more insight into him? How do you find that works?
I think it's, first of all, it's comparatively unique. It's definitely the best example of that full on just a monologue within a straight horror film that I've seen, like almost no dialogue. Yeah. The fact that it's built, and again, like I said, I didn't know this until quite recently, but the fact that it's built from sort of case files, this dialogue. Like it did feel very authentic, and I think that it's interesting because he's not, at no point is he telling the audience that he's justified, because the idea that he's not justified has never come into his mind.
Yes.
You know, like he's like, oh, I've got a good idea. I'll keep the bodies and then I can scare people with them.
Yes.
And it's just like, this is just a thing that I've thought of and it's normal.
Yeah.
And you, the audience, who's sort of like strapped in with him, like strapped to him like the camera is, having to follow him around. He's like, that's not fucking normal. What are you doing?
Yeah, yeah, it's true.
And you're being sort of pulled along, but you get this insight into what's these sort of machinations where he's doing these terrible things and he's not justifying them. They're just the thing he has to do. Right at the beginning when he talks about the old woman who he's just like, he's coming out of prison for the 10 years he spent stabbing her. And 10 years he spent for stabbing her, not 10 years he spent stabbing her.
Yes.
And he says, I just had to do it. Like, I just knew that it was, you know, I didn't rob her. I didn't take any money. It was just the thing that I had to do at that point. And that's horrifying.
It is. And I think it's interesting as well that the movie is, you kind of have to keep up, especially watching it subtitled. I wonder if it's different watching it dubbed. I know that Gaspar Noé said he prefers the dubbed French version to subtitled, because there is a lot of you having to keep up with what he's saying in his inner monologue. And there's a lot of action going on at the same time on screen, right?
Yeah.
Which is usually not a problem, but I did at times find it quite difficult because, like, he's filling us in on his backstory about, you know, his mother who was abusing him and she was a sex worker, right? And all of this stuff. And that's all kind of really kind of dense backstory that he's filling you in on at the same time as you're watching something really intense happen on the screen, like him attacking a woman or him tying someone up or him chasing someone around the house or attacking a taxi driver, you know, and you are kind of constantly going, right, okay, what, and this, and he's filling me in on this, and, you know, it's I love this kind of feeling of the past and the present kind of overlapping here.
Yeah, and he never says it's because of these things in my childhood that I'm doing this, but it's very easy for the audience to make those connections. Like when in the film, the older woman has passed out.
Yes.
And he wants her to wake up because he wants to show her the body of her son so that she's properly scared before he kills her.
Yes.
And in the film, he scrabbles around and he gives her pills to wake her up. That's true. That happened. The guy gave this woman her own heart medication, made sure she took her heart meds so she wouldn't die of a heart attack, so that he could continue being a fucking horrible psycho.
Yeah.
And that's such a gruesome little detail to put in there.
Yeah.
But then while he's doing that, he is talking about his mother, and but also he's saying, you know, and then when I've shown her dead son, then she'll understand, then she'll respect me.
Yes, exactly.
And it's very easy to draw those lines between the past that he's discussing and the things that he's doing now.
What do you think of, just like out of interest as well, the sort of production design and the home itself here as well? That's something that I've been asking people a lot about throughout all these home invasion movies. Obviously, the kind of geography of the space is often quite important. And this movie, it feels like, as with so many, they're often quite affluent homes, it feels like, you know, glass and big rooms and, you know, dark corridors and staircases and that kind of thing. But do you think it's kind of used effectively in terms of the geography of the space itself in this film?
I do. I mean, there's enough space for him to run around in, and you need a certain amount of space to film in, because you just, on a technical level, it's very difficult to film in cramped spaces, even if you're shooting everything in a mirror.
Yeah.
But I think with this film, it's probably a byproduct of what they had available.
Yeah.
It's a house that it belongs, I think it was a friend of the director's, the house. I'm assuming it was not being lived in at the time because it's basically empty.
Yeah.
And if a family have a second empty home, it's probably going to be there's a good chance they're a well-off family, so it's not going to be a small place. That said, they do break a lot of windows.
Oh my god, they do. And I really worried for the poor dog at one point, because I swear I saw the dog like crawl over some broken glass, and I was like, oh my god. I was nervous for that little dog the whole time.
The dog is Rybczynski's dog.
Oh.
He belonged to the cinematographer, and he went with him to America when he went over there to do music videos for like Art of Noise and stuff like that.
It's an adorable dog.
I love him, and my dogs loved loved watching him.
Oh.
He was their favourite bit.
He was incredible. The lighting I loved as well. You know, like those shots where he's kind of hiding in the dark in a kind of blue light, and then on the other side of the frame, you've got the kind of orangey outside sort of landing where the daughter's walking around or whatever. Like, again, like, unbelievable that you said so much of this was just like shot in a mirror or not looking, because every shot of this film looked exquisite, I thought, you know?
Well, that's it. I mean, Rybczynski knew what he was doing from a cinematography level. He knows lenses, he knows film stock, he knows film speed. He's going to be able to put it together. The framing is the thing that's astonishing from that side.
Yeah.
Worth noting, by the way, in the real story, the family didn't have a dog. They had a cat, and he killed it. So once again, they pulled back. They were nicer. He
really
wasn't
did.
as bad.
So let's talk about the violence itself then, the killing of these three in the house. Again, like, it's not necessarily the most violent thing we've ever seen, but like, what do you think of the way the violence is handled in this? And also, just from your perspective, Dan, the kind of practical effects as well.
I mean, there's not that much in the way of practical effects. There's some corpse makeup that's pretty interesting, pretty bold. The first killing, the strangling, the drowning, strangling and then drowning. Is pretty intense, but I think most of that is down to who the victim is and the situation of the victim, which is quite intense. And I think is probably a thing that upset censors, and that extra, like, push them that extra level of upset, because that's someone who can't defend themselves.
Yes.
The pushing down the stairs of the mother in the wheelchair, that shot where she slams into the wall, which is done as a stop motion shot, because it was the only way they could get that stunt. This film came out the same year that Rybczynski got the Oscar for Tango for his short animated film. Mm-hmm. So, like, you've got an Oscar-winning, by the time it's out, Oscar-winning animation director doing your cinematography, and he just says the best way to get this shot is to do it with stop motion, but sort of like Bolex Brothers style, using a person as a puppet, and it's great. And then later he goes back past that window, and she's still stood up, past that doorway rather, and she's still stood up. It's absolutely fantastic.
It's so good, isn't it? And then, of course, we get the really brutal death of the daughter in that kind of,
the
like,
very, very bloody death.
In that kind of, like, what is that? Is that like a tunnel under the house or a drive or something? Like, it's like a weird.
Yeah,
like...
I think it's like an access tunnel under the house. I don't know.
Right,
but yeah, and the bit where he's, I think, dragging her around and the dog's going, like, biting at his suit, and it's quite intense for something where you see actually very little on screen. It's really very intense.
This bit is the most intense. This bit is the most, quote unquote extreme moment, I would say. Like when he stabs her and then he's kind of drinking the blood, and then it looks like he vomits on her,
which is directly from the thingy vampire, the other killer. He wanted to try to drink their blood and then would vomit.
Jesus, it's like goes back to our conversation about Martin last year, doesn't it? That's
I wonder, like, of all the films that owe a debt to this, I do wonder slightly if this owes a debt to Martin, just a little bit.
Yeah.
Like whether or not
there is,
seen
again,
it.
the way we talk about him as this being this almost kind of like slight, nervous, skittish guy, there is something of Martin about that, isn't there? Definitely.
Well, and who has this very this idea of how he's behaving and the normalcy or necessity of what he's doing that's so divorced from what anyone else would think.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And then it's interesting, this movie structurally, isn't it? Because that all kind of happens in the first half, right? And then it's sort of the aftermath. It's like, wow, the home invasion part is done. The murders are done. And now we watch him, sort of decide what he's going to do next and put the bodies in the trunk of the car. And there's so much of it then is us just with him as he does this, right, around the house. It's kind of interesting. It's like a big chunk of time here on spent on that.
Yeah, he's got all his plan. And that's the bit where he says, I've got a good idea. I'll get other people. I'll murder them. I'll lock them up with these bodies. That'll really scare them. Yes. And then I can murder them after they're really scared, because that's important for some reason. So he stuffs the bodies in the trunk of the family car and takes them with him, which he did. That's real.
Wow.
In the real case, the mother had thought it was a burglary and had given him a check when she first saw him, because she was scared, and when he put the bodies in the car, he just went into town and went on like a shopping spree with that check, with the bodies in the car.
Wow. It's weird, isn't it? It almost, you watch this film not knowing about any of this, and it does almost feel like absurd, some of the things that happen in this film. Like, it feels like an absurdist kind of story. But so much of this actually happened. It's crazy.
And yet it's somehow less absurd than the real version, which had that extra level of craziness on it.
Insane. Absolutely insane. Yeah. How do you find that then structurally, like the second half of this film, after we've had all the action, I suppose, of the first half? Like, does it still kind of keep up that momentum for you in terms of everything that happens in that final act?
It's not as frantic, but I think it's still very valid because you're still with this guy. I think the aftermath, it's one of the things that horror films deal with very rarely is what happens afterwards. Yeah. So often it's like, hooray, we saved the day. We killed a guy that killed 6 of our friends, and that's the end. Don't worry about all of the fucking horrible therapy and trauma and PTSD that we're going to be dealing with.
Yeah.
And I think that, some films, again, it's slightly steered by being based on true events, but some films will find it very easy to end there, like with the murder, with him, or with the bodies in the back of the car or whatever, or even with the car crash. But which is a great scene, like him freaking out in the car with all those kids in yellow coats, like milling around outside of the jacket, outside the car. Absolutely fantastic. While it doesn't have quite the same frantic nature of the first half, because he's not running around as much, he remains as frantic, and I think it's really interesting staying with him and watching him sort of like plan his next move, because he kind of stumbled into the house, like he didn't go there for a reason. He just ran away from that taxi driver when she turned out to be slightly harder to throttle than he expected, and so he's kind of making it up as he goes along. Yeah. But then right at the beginning, when he first comes out of prison, he's like, I know, this is exactly what I want to do. Yeah. And he scopes out those girls in the cafe, and he's like, oh, well, maybe them, or who should I murder? Yeah.
And it's nice and kind of cyclical in a way that he ends up back at that cafe, right? And he ends up back seeing the same people again at the end, having done all the things he's done as well. Yeah. It's, again, it's kind of like strange and almost absurdist, but it really works. I found it kind of weirdly mesmerizing, this whole second half. Yeah, absolutely.
I love when he takes the plate outside. He just fucks off with the plate of food, and they're like, what are you doing? In real life, they called the police because he had too much money with him, and he didn't take his gloves off while he ate a meal.
Amazing. I love that.
Which he doesn't in the film as well. They kept that detail.
Yeah, that's right. As he eats his sausage. Yeah.
Dipping his sausage in mustard with black leather driving gloves on.
I love it. Wow, what a film, right? And so you mentioned this briefly earlier, but what was the general reaction to this film then when it was first released? People weren't happy.
Everybody was cross, and the director went bankrupt.
Oh god, it's so sad, isn't it? Given how good this film is.
The American disc has a fantastic interview with him, where he's being interviewed by Jörg Buttgereit, director of Necromantic.
Yeah.
So another director not unfamiliar with controversy. And he talks quite frankly about like how hard that was, and how like the disc might be an opportunity to actually maybe make some money on the film. Maybe.
Yeah.
It's a good disc. It's got a lovely interview with Rubczynski where he shows photographs and designs of a bunch of the rigs that he built, including talking at length about the having to film in the mirrors and using this periscope lens that he'd designed and all this stuff.
Yeah, and of course there is an intro from Gaspar Noé as well, and like I feel like we should talk about some of the filmmakers that this influenced, because as soon as this started, I was like, oh my god, it looks like a Gaspar Noé film, right? Yeah. There's something about the camera, the tone, clearly such an important film to him and his career, right?
Yeah, I think I said to you in messages before we started recording that Angst is the cordial from which you make the drink that is Gaspar Noé films.
Exactly,
I rewatched about I didn't have time for all of it, sadly, but I rewatched about 2/3 of I Stand Alone before we recorded this, because I wanted to go back to it, because I hadn't actually rewatched it since I had watched Angst the first time back in 2019.
Yeah.
And it's like so much of it, the constant narration, the stop motion zoom ins, like the unbelievably unpleasant lead.
Yes.
But then Noé sort of like manages to push it further, and yet that is, I mean, not that I Stand Alone is being shown on TV every weekend, but I Stand Alone has hardcore in it, has hardcore sex cut into it. Like it's got incest, it's got a pregnant woman being punched until she doesn't have a child anymore. Like that's an intense film. That's a harder film in some ways than Angst, and yet it's certainly, I think it's more widely known, but also it's somehow, I think Angst might still be more uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because of the way it's so frantic.
Yeah.
The cinematography, I think, is the thing that pinches it.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with you. It's the mania, I think, of this movie that really kind of adds something, doesn't it? Do you see its kind of influence elsewhere as well? You know, I guess you could talk about any kind of... I thought about stuff like The House That Jack Built too, or any of these kind of movies that kind of put us in the headspace of a serial killer, true, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. It really does feel like it's cast such a shadow. And even if a film isn't directly influenced by it, it's probably influenced by films that were influenced by it. It's there's an order of magnitude there with the ripples that it's put out into the cinematic pond have gone very, very far and bounced back from every shore.
Love it. It's
part of the fabric of the subgenre now.
It really is. It's and you know, it's such a interesting thing as well with Home Invasion. So much of Home Invasion does end with the invader winning and killing the people in the house, as happens in this movie, right? That seems like another kind of trope of the subgenre, is that is it's kind of a bit nihilistic, and it's kind of a bit like, oh well, that's it, what's the point in everything, kind of an end to a lot of home invasion movies as well, right? Which is, you sort of get a little bit in this film too. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he still gets his comeuppance.
Yes.
But it doesn't feel like moralizing. Like I was watching an old spy movie called The Safecracker a little while ago, where a guy who's sick and tired of being exploited by capitalism and not making any money for his very unique skills does a bit of robbing, like taking antiques from rich people who hide them away from society, which feels like a justified crime in a modern context, in a modern late stage capitalist context. But he's put in prison. Yeah. Then the Second World War happens, and he's allowed out of prison to go with a special crack team to break into a Nazi safe and get a list of spies. And that's his big thing.
Amazing.
And he gets shot by the Nazis because he can't fucking help himself from stealing a trinket. And it means he's in that room those extra couple of seconds, and the Nazis shoot him, and then but they get the list, and that's good, and that helps the war effort. And they get back and they tell his mum he's dead now, and she's like, "I'm so proud."
Oh God!
And that's the end. Oh, at least he died. At least he died in the war instead of still being alive in prison.
Oh my God!
And it's just like this really uncomfortable scoop of like outdated morality at the end.
Grim, absolutely grim.
But that, yeah. So it'd be so easy for films like this to do that, especially because he did genuinely get caught, and you know they could easily do. But that last crane shot at the end where you see everyone just like standing around being like, what the fuck have we just witnessed? There's 3 bodies in this car.
Yeah, it's and it did almost at times for me push over into being funny as well, and I don't know if that's intentional or not, but there is something that of the absurd about it. You know, those moments when he gets really like physically excited at making his plans and you know, all of this, like, again, there is something about it that is, that kind of almost made me chuckle. But it's in a very uncomfortable way.
The concept of the grotesque sits between the horrific and the comic.
Yeah.
Like, so many of those things, like, you know, you take physical, like, injury, and it can be horror or it can be slapstick.
Yeah.
You take scatology, and it can be toilet humor or it can be stomach churning, like nauseating cinema. Like so many of these things, it's something I talk about with directors about beheadings quite a lot, because beheadings are one of these things that's really hard to do in a way that's not slightly funny. Because we can't relate to it. So even though it's a fatal act and it's in its death, it's a bit funny.
Yes,
you know,
you're right.
So you compare that amazing 9/10 decapitation in 30 Days of Night, which is grueling and unpleasant.
Yeah.
And then look at all the ones in Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. And actually, there's a there's a pretty good, effective one in Henry too. Actually, that was pretty nasty,
and an afterthought as well.
Right, interesting. So there you go. So we should move on to Henry in a second. Any final thoughts, Dan, on Angst? I mean, the film is 40 years old now. Do you think it holds up well?
I really think it does. It's one of these ones where the aesthetic. I think partly because the aesthetic has become fashionable again. But it doesn't feel dated. Because it's so stylized, it's not relying on choices or tastes of the era. It just happens to be shot on film at that time, so the fashion is that. But even then, it's not so like hilarious in its fashion choices and that kind of stuff.
No, I think it looks remarkable. I'm sad that more people aren't able to see it in the UK. I'd quite like to screen this film. Like, I feel like, we've been screening so many films from 1983 because they've all been having anniversaries this year.
You can screen this film, Mike.
Really?
You can get dispensation from a local council, from a borough council, to show an unrated film.
I might see if I can do that because, like, it feels unfair. That,
it's going to come down to who owns the rights in the UK.
Well, that's it. Yeah. Because more people should see this film, and I bet it would look amazing on the big screen as well, But
absolutely.
But yeah, I absolutely loved it. Really, really interesting film. So that's Angst from 1983. Hello, everyone. Just interrupting this week's episode momentarily to announce that if you are listening to this episode on the day it came out, then this Sunday, that's Sunday the 9th of July, at 7 p.m. UK time, I am going to be hosting a very special online podcasting masterclass. This is available for anyone who wants to buy a ticket and come and join the discussion. It's going to be a really fun kind of like informal Zoom call, but I'm going to be going through a few of my tips and hints for how to create a successful podcast. If you want to get into the world of movie podcasting or horror movie podcasting, as so many people have done and so many people have found success with, I can try and help you find a way to do that. As somebody who started this podcast as a hobby and now does it as a full-time job, hopefully I'll be able to provide a bit of insight. And I'm also going to give attendees a little behind-the-scenes look at how a typical episode of the Evolution of Horror is made. So if you fancy coming along to that, just head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events and you will find a link to the ticket page. It's £5 to come along and be a part of this virtual masterclass. Or if you're an Evolution of Horror patron, you get a discount and you can attend for just £3. So please do come along. There are limited spaces available, but there are still a handful left. So grab a ticket while you can if you want to join me for that masterclass. And this masterclass is the first in a series of workshops and talks that we're going to be hosting over the next few months and throughout the rest of the year. It's going to be part of what we are now calling the EOH Academy. The EOH Academy is going to give people a chance to hear from experts within the world of horror, whether they're filmmakers, special effects artists, bloggers, podcasters, journalists, actors, whatever it might be, and hopefully can learn a little bit about various different skills within the industry. So this is the first Evolution of Horror Academy talk, and it's going to be just me giving a podcasting masterclass. So please do enroll in our academy and join me for that workshop. Just head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events.
The first question any platform is going to ask is, what's the hook?
The first step is to recognize that you're not in control of this.
Is that Salma Hayek?
Bingo.
That was a little clip you just heard there from the new series of Black Mirror. Charlie Brooker's brilliant sci-fi horror anthology show is back. Its 6th season dropped on Netflix a couple of weeks ago, and that's what we discussed over on Patreon this week. I was joined by my lovely wife and film critic Rihanna Dillon, and we discussed the whole 6th season of Black Mirror in spoilerific detail and go through it episode by episode. So if you want to hear that discussion as well as a whole bunch of other bonus episodes, that's available for $5 patrons. If you sign up at $5 per month, you will get access to at least one one bonus episode per month, usually 2 or 3. You will always get access to our monthly Fresh Blood Strand, in which we review and recommend all new releases in the world of horror, and you'll also have a whole back catalogue of over 200 other episodes to listen to. So that's what you get if you sign up at a $5 level. If you sign up at $10, you will get a brand new bonus episode every single week on top of the main feed. So as well as all of the $5 episodes, you'll also get access to our exclusive mini-seasons, including our franchise retrospectives and a whole bunch of other mini-seasons, including our Extreme mini-season, our Legends of Horror season, our International Horror series, and a whole bunch of others. So if you want to listen to all of this bonus content, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Anybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a little mention on the main feed as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of June a little thanks. So, a big thank you to Cryptolik, Cowam, Fix, Cobra, Dane Henwood, Andrew Bocht, Jason K, Steve Larder, Pear, Nick, James Simpson, Evan, Maxarus Roth, Lars Sorensen, Rachel Doyle, Agonizing Rectal Pain, excellent, Elise Mansell, Tarek Monsieur, Cinemaniac, Pauline Makoko, Noel N, Gareth Hodson, Grace Nick Ord, Ellie Alvey, Logan Thies, Nicholas Surf, Stephanie, Katie Peterson, David Finlayson, Maria Kakachi, Brad Purcell, Callum, Ed Carter, Kaylee Lindsay, Ignacio Sadu, Peter Kendrick, Diane Crotty, Aisa Guerrera, Holt Evans, Leah Moore, Led Lemonade, Martina LaForce, Jan Mayer, and Graham Ginty. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up in the month of June. And if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's discussion, in which Dan Martin and I jump forward 3 years to discuss the brilliant and disturbing Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer from 1986.
Did you really kill your mama?
What?
Did you really kill your mama?
I guess I did.
She must have treated you real bad.
She was a whore. You used to dance naked?
Sure, all the time around the house.
Otis,
Best little naked dancer you ever saw.
you never.
Again, sort of semi-based on reality, although this one sort of embraces its unreliable narrator a little more. Something that it plays with nicely as the film progresses. But ostensibly it tells the story of Henry Lucas and Otis Elwood Toole, two friends who met in prison. They were cellmates in prison, and they now hang out in Chicago. Otis's sister turns up in town, escaping an abusive relationship after her partner is incarcerated. Henry takes a shine to her, as does her brother, unfortunately, or as has her brother in the past. That resurfaces. And Henry, the titular serial killer, at the same time is introducing Otis to the world of serial killing and telling him how to get away with it, which is one of the ways in which this film so heavily fell foul of the British censors.
I love that. So, Dan, when I take it you probably discovered this film earlier than Angst, right? What's your sort of history with this one?
So I saw this in its cut version, and not just cut, but heavily re-edited. James Furman took it upon himself to re-edit the film without the oversight of the director, without John McNaughton knowing that he was doing it. He just completely recut the film.
Jesus.
So I saw it on VHS in the UK, was absolutely blown away by it. But also heard pretty quickly that there was an uncut version. And this was in my early days of trying to track down imported bootlegs and gotta see the long version, gotta see those extra 3 seconds.
Yeah.
And I did eventually manage to find it, and it's horrible. Those extra seconds are horrible. I'm not saying James Furman was right. He's a fucking monster for what he did to that film, but it's horrible.
Will I have seen the uncut version? I'm assuming
it's uncut now. Yeah.
Fine.
The current prints. I think it's been uncut for a while, but the new 4K from Arrow is definitely fully uncut.
Yeah. I saw this film probably way too young, and it's really funny. Like, I was thinking about why I saw it, and I think I thought that it was a slasher film. Like, and it was funny because I was looking even at posters for it on Google Images right now, and the tagline on some of them is "He's not Freddy, he's not Jason, he's Henry." Like, it's almost like it's trying to cash in on a kind of slasher movie trend, right, in 1986, which is so funny because, of course, it couldn't be more different to that. And I remember watching it probably way too young. I was about 15, 16, and I was just like, what the fuck is this? You know, it was just a little bit too grim and too real for me. And I hadn't watched it in years and years and years. So it's been really, really interesting to revisit it. But actually, even it'd been so long since I saw it, but I remembered it so clearly. Like, the images, the tone, the performances, it really, like, it played out almost exactly as I remembered it playing out from when I was young. So yeah, it's a pretty powerful film, isn't it, Dan? What do you think of it, you know, now, watching it now?
I feel like it's like a little time capsule. It's not really lost any of its impact. When I went, so Sam and I covered it on the Arrow podcast when Arrow did their 4K, and I watched that print of it, which is obviously gorgeous, and I hadn't seen it for a good few years before that, and it is one of those movies that's really like sticks in your brain. Like when you hear a song for the first time in a few years and the words are happening in your head like a fraction of a second before they're being spoken or being sung.
Yes, exactly that.
It's interesting because you mentioned earlier when we were talking about Angst, it's got a much more sort of cinema verite vibe to it. It's very, because it was run and gun, but in this instance, they are just out on the streets of Chicago shooting strangers sort of under the skin style.
Yeah.
Like those people didn't know they were in a movie. And shooting these in these, you know, whatever locations they can get. My brother-in-law runs a McDonald's, we can shoot in their car park. Like that was that was how they chose where they were filming. So just by its nature and by its budget, it had to be very, very sort of simple, very sparse in those aspects, which, you know, deliberately, accidentally, luckily, adds this incredible feeling of almost like newsreel footage. That first shot on the body as it pulls back feels like, you know, you might be about to see that it's like police photography. You might be about to see like a measurement line down on the ground, or like the numbered markers they put next to different bits of evidence.
Exactly that.
But then it does have some interesting stylistic choices as well, like playing the audio. So especially for the first chunk of the film, you see the aftermath, you see the bodies instead of seeing the killings. And I think originally you weren't necessarily meant to know that Henry was the killer, because the original title wasn't Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. It was just Henry. And it was the distributors who had funded it said they had to call it Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer because it was the same year. I think it was like when they were putting it on their sales list, it was going to be next to like Henry V and
like, fair enough.
all these Shakespeare adaptations, and they wanted it to stand out. So you know that Henry is the murderer much earlier in the film than I think was initially intended in the first script. But those bits of audio, some of the bits of stylization that come in and juxtapose with this very verite vibe, make it feel really. And then later on, you've got that sort of found footage, almost like snuff element to it as well, which takes it into the next level of realism as well.
Yes.
So it really plays with making you feel uncomfortable by presenting this stuff as factual.
Yes, it really, really does, doesn't it? It's quite upsetting and disturbing. And again, you mentioned this with the previous film, like this movie, I feel like even more so, there is nothing titillating or sensationalizing about any of the violence here. Like it's grim, isn't it? This film is kind of just grim from beginning to end in that regard.
It is. I would say that I think the scene in the secondhand electronics shop or the stolen electronics shop is slightly played for laughs.
Oh yeah, that guy that gets like stabbed. Yeah.
The I'll just plug it in That
yes, that's true.
like
that's true.
he smashes a TV on his head. Like that's a slapstick move.
Yes, that's true.
But because that comes just before, because that's when they get the camera, and then that comes just before the rewind it, I want to watch it again scene, which is so fucking horrible.
Horrible. Yeah.
It's by giving the audience that little bit of slightly weird genre levity, you can like really plunge them back into the icy bath of upset.
Yeah. Completely agree. And do you think this movie was influenced by Angst as well? Like, do you see a kind of through line, a connection here between these two films?
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing is, long before Angst, because it has a foot in truth, there's been a stereotype of his mother was a sex worker and that kind of thing. And so there are connections between them that might be coincidental, but there are choices. It's difficult because they're both based on real people, albeit like slightly fictitious versions of those real people. It's hard to say. I would be very surprised if McNaughton hadn't seen and loved Angst, but if he said, or if he said in an interview that he hadn't seen it until after he made Henry, I don't know if I believe him. I don't know if I disbelieve him. I don't know where I stand. It's hard. Like, I genuinely feel like that it owes a debt to Angst.
Yeah, I would say
but it's also just dealing with a very similar subject matter, and it's another version of that being made by a very competent filmmaker.
Yes.
So it just happens to be another very good version. It is less of a home invasion movie than Angst. It just has really just that one scene, and you don't see it happen. You see it being revisited in a sort of because they film it on this camera and they go back and they rewatch it, which again, without wanting to get too film academic about it, feels like a comment on like the desire to watch these things and like the fear that culture has around nasties. You said that it was, they tried to market it ostensibly as a slasher, which is a weird misstep, but the slasher craze was going on at that time. So as a result, obviously the other side of that means that people are being outraged and horrified. So there's a lot of stuff being done about the danger of media and all that kind of stuff. So when they're watching their own murders back on TV, having filmed them, that, you can't help but think that that's got to be making reference to people being worried about media and horror and what people watch on TV.
Totally. And it's a weird, almost like, I don't know. I don't know if red herring is the right term, but that whole video camera sort of device, I thought, I couldn't remember. I was like, does this lead somewhere? Does Becky discover that they're killers by finding this footage? Or is there... No, it just sort of comes to nothing. Like that video camera gets smashed and they lose it, right? But it's interesting, that stuff that...
but Otis has fallen asleep watching that tape when Henry comes back in, before the sort of the denouement happens. Yeah. And I always thought that was one of the rungs on the ladder to Henry deciding Otis had to go.
Yeah.
Because Otis is a liability. And obviously the tipping point is not about his untrustworthiness as a co-conspirator in a string of murders. It's about how he behaves with Becky, but Henry's I think he's ready for that to be necessary.
What do we think of Henry? I mean, we should talk about Henry and Otis, really. It's kind of a portrait of two serial killers here, isn't it? But Henry specifically, especially in comparison to our psychopath in Angst, so much more kind of controlled. And also, you mentioned this in your plot synopsis, he's a lot more of a kind of closed book, right? We don't really know much about him. His story is deliberately quite kind of opaque, and we don't really know what to believe about him and what not to. But yeah, what do you make of this character of Henry?
In real life, he's an interesting person because it became apparent that he was being used by the police to mark unsolved murders as solved.
Yeah, didn't he confess to like hundreds of murders?
600 murders.
Holy shit!
He claimed.
Oh my god!
And they had to completely revisit how interrogation was done because of Henry, because they were letting him look at the crime files to refresh his memory when he was boasting about having done all these murders. So they were being like, oh yeah, no, I definitely did this, and she was wearing this, and they were like, well, how could he have known that? It's like, because you showed him the photo of it. Like, that's how.
Oh my god.
So like they think maybe like he was I think he was arrested for 60. He confessed to 200, and then later that went up to 600, and then he recanted a bunch of those. But Otis, who did not die in that way in real life, Otis died of cirrhosis of the liver in prison.
Right. Wow. Okay.
Where he was arrested for arson, and when he was being questioned about the arson, he confessed to another arson in which someone had died because a boyfriend of his had been. They got in an argument, and he set fire to his house, and he died.
Wow.
And then later he claimed he'd done a bunch of murders as well. Like him and Henry together, like they sort of they probably did do stuff together. Like that seems almost certain. But they had a lot of stuff pinned on them that wasn't them because it helped the police close books.
It's interesting, right, that ambiguity about Henry is played into the film. Like, we don't really know much about his backstory. Whenever he does reveal about details about his mother and how he killed her, those details keep changing, don't they, as well? So there's something really interesting about that.
But what it never does is it never says he's a liar or he's insane. Like, it leaves you with a big question mark there. You don't know if he's like, there's very few things you ever know for sure about him. You know he kills people, and you know he can't read, and that's pretty much it. Like, you don't know if his mum was a sex worker for real. That might be a lie. You don't know that he killed her, and if he did kill her, you don't know how he killed her. And when he's telling Becky about it, he makes a mistake like 2 sentences apart. He's like, and then I shot her dead, and she's like, I thought you said you stabbed her, and he's like, I said that. Oh yeah, maybe it must have been that. Like, when he's when he's saying I killed my mother, she reacts with disbelief, and he's like, "Do you think I'm lying?" Yeah. And he's terrifying because he's got a very Lenny from Of Mice and Men, but if he was a fucking maniac,
exactly,
like vibe to him. He's this. If he wasn't psychologically damaged in the way that he is, he would be a gentle giant. Right.
Yeah, that's true, because there is also something about him that is like, I don't know, warm is too strong a word, but Becky warms to him, right? There is something like he doesn't seem as outwardly sleazy and dangerous as Otis, for example, you know?
Yeah, I mean, Otis is a piece of shit, and Henry definitely like comes off as looking comparably gentlemanly next to his his awful friend. There's a missing scene from the film that they wrote. I don't think they shot it, where you see that Henry and Otis are in a relationship because they had got together in prison.
Ah, interesting.
And actually, on files about the real Otis, his profession is described as, he's just down as prostitute vagrant.
Oh god,
that was his job.
Oh god, yeah, because of course it does hint at that Otis is maybe gay, maybe bisexual or something, right? But you see him hitting on a young guy at one point, right?
Yeah,
that's interesting, and I did wonder whether there was any kind of subtext there of these two serial killers living together and killing together and everything else. You know, were they ever together? Yeah.
So the idea was that they were together in prison, and then maybe occasionally after prison as well. But that's the other thing, is that like, you don't get told how long they've been out of prison or how long they've been living together. But what you do know is that Otis doesn't know that Henry kills people at the beginning of the film, because we see him find out, because they go out together, they pick up those girls, and then Henry's just snapping necks.
Yeah.
And he gives that sort of lovely speech, where he says, he's like, "You've killed before," and Otis is like, yeah, loads. I've done loads of killings. And we're like, has he though? And he's like, but I had no choice. And Henry just goes, "You've never got a choice. It's always you or them eventually." And it's like, oh wow, okay, so there's a little bit of truth from Henry. Like, whatever we know about his childhood, he has grown up in a way where he now feels that everyone is a threat, and eventually he's gonna have to kill people.
Yes, like
that's just how he's wired.
Yeah. There's such a coldness about him, isn't there? And we'll talk about the ending, but I think there's that. I love the sucker punch of the ending, because you kind of almost feel like, oh, he's all right with Becky, they're gonna be okay, and then of course not. It's like, no, this man is a serial killer. Like, this is what he does. It's it's pretty powerful.
he kills her brother to save her. But I mean, you say she warms to him, but we know, like, we hear about her relationship with her father, fucking horrible.
Yeah.
We've seen her relationship with Otis. We know that her husband, boyfriend, I can't remember, the father of her child, who's now living with her mum, is in prison for murder and was abusive. So, like, she's obviously got issues that cause her to choose people like him.
Yes, that's a good point.
And he's obviously, like, triggering those issues within her while still feeling comparatively safe. Like, he obviously cares for her. It's just that that's not enough to undo the damage that he's got in his head.
And what is it that triggers Otis to suddenly become this serial killer? Because, like you say, he's kind of quite shocked and almost disgusted at the beginning when Henry kills that sex worker in the car, right? And then suddenly something just flips in him, doesn't it? It's or was it always in him from the beginning? I don't know.
Well, I think Otis is by and large a serial rapist.
Yes,
and both incestuous and non-incestuous, and that the murder is almost like a byproduct of that. Like when you see that film of the family,
oh my god,
Otis is making it sexual.
Yes.
Henry is not. Henry is killing people because it's what he does, it's who he is. Otis is killing people because he's hanging out with Henry.
Yeah, absolutely. There is actually Henry as a character that we see is very much not interested in sex, or almost kind of recoils, right?
He's scared of
yes.
it. Yeah. That scene with Becky, he's genuinely, like, worried about it, scared of it.
I love that. And the performance is so powerful. What do we think of Michael Rooker's performance? You know, because what an actor. You know, these days people might recognize him from shows like The Walking Dead, or he was in the Guardians of the Galaxy films, right, as well. So he's in quite a lot of big mainstream stuff. But what do you think of him here as Henry?
Yeah, he's incredible. He's amazing. I mean, he's a huge dominating presence. He's a big guy. Just as the real Lucas was. He's very good at that sort of staid, emotionless performance, but without making it feel wooden or under-delivered. He's fantastic. He does a very good job of tricking you into thinking, oh, this guy's quite nice.
I know.
At times, like, oh, look, he genuinely cares. Remember, he's a murderer.
I know. I love that. I love that about this film, that it does really play with you in that regard. And they all three lead performances I think are great, actually. And this kind of this weird family-esque dynamic of Henry, Otis, and Becky living together is a kind of really interesting one, isn't it? I think, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an unwanted love triangle, is what it is.
Yes, exactly that. It's a really, really fucked up love triangle, isn't it? That whole sequence when she, has to take her top off to put on a t-shirt, and she's telling him not to look, but you kind of get the feeling that she's almost wants Henry to look, like she's looking at Henry, but meanwhile the brother Otis is looking at her and pretending not to and stuff, and I'm like, this is all kinds of wrong in so many ways, you know?
Absolutely, and that's the first opportunity for Henry to slightly save her from Otis, because he grabs Otis and says, no, that's your sister, don't do that. And so there is this sort of morality within him, albeit broken and very small, but he does feel that there are some rules.
And the compared to the big affluent homes of Angst, or home of Angst, everything is very claustrophobic, isn't it, in this? Again, we're in much kind of smaller, and maybe apart from that actual home invasion sequence, actually, to be fair, which looks like a bigger home, but like for the most part we're in these kind of quite grotty small spaces, aren't we? Or we're in like kind of underpass tunnels or back alleys and that kind of thing, and again it kind of really kind of gives you that feeling of being trapped with these characters, I think.
I mean, it's urban Chicago of the 80s. It's, these aren't palaces, and I'm sure the places looked a lot nicer before art department got in there and covered everything in tea stains and to make it look filthy. But they're not massive spaces at all. And I think part of that is added to by Rooker's size as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think there's something interesting as well in that we never see, like, there's no police, there's no one to come in and save anyone really in this film ever as well, right? And, if you think, like, this was the same year as Manhunter, and it felt like we were right on the cusp of so many interesting kind of forensic movies about cops catching serial killers, right? And this movie, it shares some stylistic similarities with that. Like you said, those kind of shots of the bodies at the beginning almost look like those kind of Seven-esque, you know, those forensic photographs or whatever. But there are no police in this world. Like, it feels like there is no one, almost like, I mean, apart from Becky, really, there's just like no one good in this movie as well, you know? It's that kind of also makes it feel all the more kind of grim and uncomfortable and frightening.
Yeah,
you know?
Literally interchangeable victims, because multiples are played by the same woman. Multiple victims played by the same lady. And two killers and Becky.
Yeah. Grim. There you go. Well, and let's finish by talking about that ending. And I suppose actually that whole denouement, that horrific sequence when Otis sexually assaults his sister, and then of course Henry comes in to save her. There's that decapitation scene and everything. What do you make of that whole sequence? Is that, I'm guessing that must have been one of the sequences that had some cuts in it originally, was it?
Yeah, I believe so. I don't have the exact list of cuts. I remember they were very upset with them rewinding the videotape. That had to go.
Okay.
And like part of me feels like they didn't want to like tell people, oh, you know what? You can rewind tapes to like watch nasty stuff again. Like, God, if they find out about that, we're all, society's going to fall over. So that was a big deal. They didn't like the instructional nature of it, that it was telling you, oh, you know, don't choose people that look alike. You know, you got to shoot one guy, stab another guy. You can't leave any trails. Don't do it to someone you know. You don't go after him because you're mad at him. Go kill someone else. Like,
yeah,
they didn't like that stuff, and then obviously, the sexual assault is going to be a big issue. Like the BBFC have always, and they're nowadays they're less opaque than they used to be, and they'll advise filmmakers if they want to like try and sidestep this stuff. But one of the things they have a problem with is people who can't defend themselves being brutalized. So it's two people exchanging punches is one thing. Someone like half unconscious on the ground being kicked is considered much, much worse because they're not in a position to be able to like save themselves. And sexual violence is obviously also very much very problematic.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a pretty brutal scene. They made Otis's head for the eye stab gag, and then
of course,
and had not planned to show the dismemberment, but realised, hey, we've got this head. Why don't we just use that? We've spent the money on it. We spent, I think they said $700 or $800, which is ridiculously low amount even then for this head. Why don't we? And it's a great shot when you see Otis over the bathtub and they lift out the head, put it in the bag.
Yeah, it's good. It's like you mentioned earlier, you know, that so many decapitations can border on comical. This one doesn't feel that way, right? That kind of like slow grind of him trying to remove the head in the bathtub and everything, and you know, there was something
you hear
about it
it
feels
before
a bit
the camera,
more gross and real.
The Foley's really good. You hear it before the camera gets into the bathroom, and then there's that like a little bit more sawing and crunching, and then the head just comes up, and it's only on screen for like a half a second, so you don't have a chance for it to be foolish. And that's one of the reasons that decapitations are often funny, is because severed heads are funny because they've got a frozen expression and they're rolling about and doing things that heads shouldn't do, so it's absurd. But in this instance, it's just a very bloody head with one eye out getting put in a bag.
And then what a cold ending, right? You know, like Becky and Henry driving off together,
talking about when they're going to go and get her kid. And
then, of course, it happens off screen. Like, we don't even see the murder happen. It's just cut to Henry's driving by himself, dumps her body from the boot of his car onto the side of the road, and that's it. It's like, wow, it's not fucking around, this film, is it?
It's but again, it's oddly restrained.
Yes,
like it is arguable that someone might not know what happened.
Oh, totally, totally. But I think that somehow makes it even more grim, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that little bit of having to work for it, even in the very small degree to which it's the case here, I think helps make the audience feel a little complicit in some of this stuff.
Yeah, and how literally throwaway that moment is of him throwing away the body, our main character.
Well, people are just garbage to him. That's the whole thing.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Like, it made me think about these, because these films are both done well in that they are so grim. Because we do, as a people, we are kind of obsessed with serial killers, aren't we? You know, like documentaries, true crime, whether it's people like Bundy, whoever. We are fascinated by serial killers, aren't we? For whatever reason, and so much, and so often they're just these horrible pieces of shit that you wouldn't actually want to, like, you know, spend any time with, even watching on screen, really. And I think these movies do that really effectively, kind of show you just how unsexy, unsensational, uninteresting these guys and their lives actually are, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an essay by, I think her name's Lindy West, who wrote the TV show Shrill. She did a book of essays called The Witches Are Coming. And I think one of the essays is called something along the lines of Ted Bundy was charismatic. Are you insane?
Right. Exactly.
And it's just a dissection of how that's such a fucking stupid thing to say.
It is. And you know, there are there's hundreds of examples, obviously, of serial killers being made extremely charismatic and interesting in films and TV shows, right? It is something that we're all kind of fascinated by. But yeah, I love that these movies are like, why are you fascinated by this person, you know? So there you go. How do you think this movie sort of holds up? You know, again, nearly 40 years old. It's like 37 years old, right? But I feel like this movie still very much does the job.
Oh, it very much does. Again, like it's a sort of a snapshot of an era, but it doesn't feel dated. It could be a period film, an indie period film from now. It's absolutely fantastic. It's still just as like jarring and confronting as it was.
Completely agree. Let's finish up, Dan. You know, you've mentioned a few other filmmakers and titles. Is there anything else that you want to mention off the back of these two movies in terms of films that maybe connect to this or have been inspired by these or anything like that?
I mean, there's just other home invasion movies I want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, go for it.
We were talking about the sort of east-west divide right at the top of the episode.
Yeah,
I was trying to think about whether there were any non-supernatural home invasion movies from Asia, and the only one I could come up with was Visitor Q, and even that's a slightly peculiar one. I love that film.
Oh yeah,
and it's about like if it wasn't for the fact that he hit the guy in the head with a brick at the beginning and used his sort of concussion against him to get into the household, it almost wouldn't count, because it's more like a confidence trick than an invasion.
Yes,
but he very much gets in and becomes part of the family through violence. So I think it tangentially
absolutely
counts. I love Visitor Q. Obviously, Funny Games is amazing.
Both versions. Do you like the remake?
I've never watched the remake.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's basically the same film. I just
decided not to.
Yeah.
I just thought, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
I'm going to watch other things.
Fair enough.
One that I think it's just had a Blu-ray, because I have a Blu-ray. I think I have a Blu-ray of it. But I saw it at Eurofest back in the 90s. Is Jorge Grau's Code of Hunting, which, if you want to ruin your day, there's a horrible fucking home invasion movie. It was criticized for being pro death penalty, which I don't know if it is, but if it isn't, they made some bad choices. It's about a left in post Franco Spain, when the gloves were off censorship wise. It was about a bunch of serial, I think they're serial thieves and rapists. I don't think they're murderers. Maybe they've killed someone, but they're spared the death penalty by a lenient judge, and they then go on a rampage and end up at her family's holiday home, and it turns into a home invasion movie, and it's unbelievably extreme.
Oh wow!
For all of the things that, like, when Spain does home invasion, fuck me. Did you see Kidnapped from a few years back?
No, I have not seen that yet. No.
Oh my goodness. It's like, it's so weird, because like there's maybe 2 moments in it that transcend it. And without them, it's a pretty pedestrian home invasion movie and just quite nasty without much merit. But it's got one bit of technical work in it that feels like you're like, oh god, did Spike Jonze direct this? Like,
wow.
it's got. I mean, I'm going to spoil it, but it's not a spoiler if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
but
sure.
It's got a long split screen sequence in it where two characters end up meeting, and it goes into not a split screen. So the two images merge into a single image.
Amazing.
And you're like, why did you do that? That's so. But it's good. It basically, a family are taken over by three masked individuals who want to extort them for money. The father is told to take all the credit cards that they have in the house, and he's going to be driven to the cash point to get out as much money as possible just before midnight. Then they'll wait until after midnight and they'll do it again. And if he tries to talk to anyone, or if he tries to run away, then his daughter and his wife will be brutalized. It has that, and then the ending is one of the most like dour and upsetting endings of any film. Like, it's so expertly unpleasant.
And they always have such dour, unpleasant endings, these movies as well, don't they?
Yeah.
I have yet to see the movies that people often talk about, some of the most extreme home invasion movies, which are the August Underground movies. I've never seen any of those.
Don't bother.
Oh, really? Okay.
Don't
Good
bother.
to know.
They're utter dog shit.
Okay.
When we're talking about like, are these titulating?
Yeah.
Someone somewhere is wanking to all the August Underground films, and it's horrible. They're devoid of skill. They're cheap. They're nasty. They're unpleasant.
Yeah.
They're the tiki torch carrying wing of the subgenre.
Amazing.
And not worth your time.
Excellent.
And I say that as someone who literally just recommended you Code of Hunting, which is vile. So
I love that.
Another one that doesn't get talked enough about is Larry Cohen's Bone. Have you seen that with Yaphet Kotto as the home invader? Absolutely amazing. Very like slightly surreal in places. Lots of Larry Cohen touches. And The Collector, which I love.
The Collector's great. And actually, I've only seen that really, really recently because, again, lots of people wrote in and told me to check that out, and it's great.
Yeah,
very
great fun.
Good.
Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Because of what it does. I don't want to spoil it. There you go. Those are my recommendations.
I love it. And what's your favourite, Dan? Do you have a favourite home invasion movie? Final question.
Well, I don't know if I would have considered it a home invasion movie if I hadn't been putting this list together, but I think it might be Visitor Q.
Yes, I love that. And I think Visitor Q is perfect. Like, I'm doing a lot of movies like that are very much not traditional home invasion movies, but movies in which people infiltrate a family or a house or a relation. I mean, even Henry obviously doesn't really have, it has that one moment of home invasion, but even this idea of the kind of reverse home invasion of an innocent finds themselves in the home or in the lair of somebody very dangerous, right? Going all the way back to the old dark house. Next week we're doing Misery. Henry is kind of that, right? This idea of Becky finding herself staying in a flat with two serial killers, and this is what happens in this domestic space.
Have you seen the new series of Black Mirror yet?
I have. It's very good.
So number 2, Beyond the Sea, that's a home invasion.
Oh my God, it is. I mean, there are literal home invasions in that, right? A very overt one, and then also these kind of different types of home invasions happening throughout. Yeah.
It feels like it's just a home invasion at the beginning, and then it uses that as a springboard, but then it's very subtly, structurally, a home invasion film throughout. So
It is. I love that. Home invasion is everywhere. So there you go. Dan, thank you so much for joining me. Usually I finish with a few plugs, and you can tell me what you've got coming up over the next few months. But maybe we should start by plugging an event that we're going to be doing together, right? We've got the 10th anniversary screening of The Borderlands happening, and we've got that coming up quite soon, right?
We do. 10th anniversary of The Borderlands. Jen and I are doing a handful of screenings, and we're very excited that the inaugural one is with you.
Yes. Amazing.
Yeah. Please, if you ask where people can find me, on the 18th of July, they'll be able to find me at the Genesis Cinema in London at 6:15 in the evening. where we're going to be doing the Borderlands on screen with Evolution of Horror, which is very exciting.
Incredible. It's I've been saying to people, come and see it, because it's, again, like, still not as well known as it should be, that film. And that movie, and I'm not exaggerating, gave me a near panic attack in its last 10 minutes. It's such a good found footage film. So yeah, come along to that. Grab yourself a ticket. Come and hang out with me and Dan and Jen and other people involved in that film. That's going to be a really good night. But other than that, Dan, where can people come and find you online and more of your stuff?
On both Twitter and Instagram, at least for now, I am at 13fingerfx, where I post work as soon as it's not embargoed and pictures of my dogs in the meantime.
Perfect. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guest, Dan Martin. So please do get in touch. Let us know what you thought of this week's episode and what you thought of these two films, Angst and Henry. Both pretty disturbing, upsetting movies, but both pretty brilliant in their own way. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and I'd be so grateful if you could spare a moment to drop us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. Next week, we venture towards the late 80s and early 90s for a really interesting little era of horror thrillers. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Becky Dark, and we are discussing a double bill of psychotic women. We're going to be talking about Fatal Attraction from 1987 and Misery from 1990. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.